Reluctantly yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Barr.
Well, let me first thank and commend Chairman McCall and Ranking Member Meeks for their work, and certainly very well intended to protect our national security by restricting U.S. investors for unwittingly financing certain sectors in China that threaten our national security, and I share their goal. But I do want to unpack this discussion about an entity-based approach versus a sector-based approach. And first of all, and the chairman and I have had many discussions on this and working through this with other colleagues on both this committee and the Financial Services Committee. I don't think the two are necessarily incompatible, and we're working on potentially marrying both approaches. But I also would disagree with the suggestion, respectfully, that a sector-based approach is, quote, stronger than an entity-based sanctions approach when in some cases, the exact opposite is true. So let's unpack that for a minute here, Mr. Pottinger. Does a sector-based outbound investment restriction block Beijing-directed subsidies at a state-owned enterprise?
Not necessarily, right?
Yeah.
If these are Chinese-invested companies,
right. So if we're restricting Americans from investing in a Chinese military company, but it's subsidized by Beijing, that regime doesn't affect the funding of that entity.
right?
And then revenue generated by the sales of goods and services. If the Chinese military or surveillance or technology company is selling goods and services globally, restricting U.S. investment doesn't impact that, correct?
That's true.
Also, investment from non-U.S. investors. Does a restriction on U.S. investment, outbound investment, does that impede investment from non-U.S. investors into that Chinese entity?
No, not unless we build a coalition to support that goal.
And Mr. Harrell, would the Biden executive order, does that in any way that lists the CMIC companies, the Chinese military industrial complex companies, are investors in other countries in any way affected by that executive order?
They're not directly affected by it, though they can't use a U.S. bank to facilitate that investment. So it probably makes it a little harder for them.
So here's the point I'm trying to make. Would full blocking SDN sanctions, if Treasury actually did it, would full blocking SDN sanctions have a multilateral extraterritorial effect that these restrictions that only apply to U.S. investors have? Would a full blocking SDN sanction have a multilateral extra-jurisdictional effect?
Yes.
So this is why I think we ought to not just dismiss this entity-based approach. And certainly the chairman is right that China, and you all are right, that China changes names and whatnot, but OFAC is particularly equipped in conjunction with the intelligence community to continue to adjust those sanctions. I want to also mention the fact that the Financial Services Committee bill that we've marked up, the Chinese Military Surveillance Company Sanctions Act, would require Treasury, I think this letter that Treasury sent back to the chairman and ranking member on Hikvision is troubling. But that's exactly why the Financial Services Committee bill would require Treasury to not just send a perfunctory letter back to the chairman, but require Treasury to do much more than that and inform the chairman, this committee, the Financial Services Committee, the Senate counterparts, on an annual basis why the Treasury Department is not imposing full blocking sanctions on Hikvision, and continually update the sanctions list, the entity list at Commerce, the CMIC list, the DOD military list on an annual basis to keep up with the changes with China. Last point, and it's a question about the bill before us today. What I'm worried about, and it's a good bill, but on page 20 and 21, it specifically talks about exceptions. Covered activity does not include an investment in publicly traded security or an index fund or a mutual fund or a venture capital fund. In other words, we might be restricting the funding, U.S. funding, but Americans under this bill, because there's not full SDN blocking sanctions, would still be able to trade in those securities. Whereas if we sanctioned full blocking sanctions on these entities, there could be no trading of these securities at all. There could be no contracts. And it would not just apply to U.S., but also non-U.S. citizens. My time has expired, but if you can comment on the strength of sanctions versus non-sanctions approach.
Congressman, I agree that sanctions, when applied, really come at a company from more angles than just an export control or even just an investment restriction, for sure. I think the challenge are ones that we've talked about. Simply, how do you incentivize the Department of Treasury to really apply those? You mentioned just a moment ago, I think, the idea of an annual requirement and so forth. I mean, I think that would be welcome.